So let's now display our filtered events. So let's work on this slug page therefore. On this page, we now got a couple of things to do. We need to extract the dynamic segment values, which are part of the URL that led to this page. And we need to extract the year and the month and then find the events that meet this year and month. Now in the dummy.data.js file, I already prepared a getFilteredEvents function, which expects an object with a year and a month key, where I then look for the events that have the respective year and month. And they need to have both. So this is not an or filter, but an and filter. I'm looking for events that have both the selected year and the selected month. So that logic is already in place, but in the slug component we now need to extract the data from the URL. And for this we again can use the useRouter hook. This gives us access to the data encoded in the URL, and this slug page is no exception. So here we now import useRouter from nextRouter, and then we create our router object by calling useRouter like this. Now here we can get our filter data by accessing router.query.slug. But what is that filter data? Well, let's recall what it is by quickly logging it to the console. That filter data. Let's log it to the console, go back here to this events page, to this filtered events page for events/2021/5, and open the DevTools and reload, and we see that it's such an array. It's an array with two elements, and the first element is the first segment, the second element is the second segment, and if we had more segments, we would have more items in that array. We also have undefined being logged here because actually this component is rendered twice because of how React works and how that route data is extracted. Effectively, this hook extracting the route data runs after the component was rendered for the first time. So the first time the component renders, we don't have access to that URL data yet. That's not a problem per se, but we'll have to make sure that we only look for filtered events once we got access to the URL data. And in addition, of course, we want to make sure that we don't try to look for events if there is a third parameter, if there is ABC at the end. Or at least we don't want to include that in our query, in our filter logic. So to make sure that this works appropriately, I'll first of all check if filter data is falsy by adding an exclamation mark here, so that when it is undefined, which it will be when the component is rendered for the first time, it's then automatically rendered again, but it is rendered without filter data when it is rendered for the first time. And when that happens, I want to return, let's say, a paragraph where I say loading. And we can give this paragraph a class name of center. And here that's a regular string because that is a globally defined CSS class in the globals CSS file. So here it's a regular string which I set as a class name to apply this global CSS class, so not a scoped class. And with that we take care that we don't get an error just because we don't have access to the URL data yet. That's simply how the useRouter hook works internally. But now, of course, when the component is then automatically rendered for the second time, we do have access to the data, and therefore now we do want to look for the appropriate events. For this, I'm only interested in the first two segments, which I know will be the year and the month. So I'll get my filtered year by accessing filtered data, the first element, and we get the filtered month by accessing the second element with index 1. Now, the data which we get here is in a string format. It's always a string because it's encoded in the URL. And I need numbers. Therefore, I'll set up my num year by transforming filtered year to a number by adding a plus in front of it. And the same here for the month. With num month, I transform this to a number by adding a plus in front of filtered month. So that transforms that data to numbers. Now, of course, for some reason, we could fail to do that. Because, for example, someone manually entered /events/abc/5. And in that case, ABC would of course not be a valid year. So we also want to handle that scenario. And therefore I'll add an if check where I check if my num year, so my year transformed to a number, is not a number, which would happen if that is a string like ABC, for example. Then we can't convert it to a number, and this here would produce not a number as a type. So I'll check if my num year is not a number, or if my num month is not a number. If either of the two failed, something is wrong about that URL. I'll also check, as an additional condition under which I want to fail, if my year, let's say, is greater than 2030, let's say that's the highest year I want to support, or if it's below 2021. And I'll also check if my month is maybe smaller than 1, which makes no sense, or if the month is greater than 12, which also makes no sense. If either of these things is true, if either of these conditions is met, I don't want to continue, because then something is wrong with the filter. So then I'll just return some output where I, for example, say, invalid filter, please adjust your values. So now with that, if we save this, and I would load this page for /events/abc5, I would get invalid filter, please adjust your values. Now, assuming that we do have a valid year and a valid month, I now can expect to find events though, at least if such events exist for the chosen year and months. So now I can get my events, my filtered events here. I can add this constant by executing getFilteredEvents, which is this function we have to import from the dummy data file. That function I showed you a couple of seconds ago. We execute this function, and this function wants to get an object with a year and a month field. So here I'll set the year field to num year and the month field to num month, passing on those converted year and month values as numbers to getFilteredEvents. That then gives us our filtered events array. Now, of course, that could be an empty array though, if we don't find any events for the chosen year and month. So therefore, we want to check if filtered events are falsy for some reason, or if they're not falsy but an empty array. So if filtered events length is maybe equal to 0. If either of these two conditions is met, then we had a valid filter, but we simply don't find any events for that filter. And in this case here, I also want to return some text where I simply say no events found for the chosen filter. Something like that. And now if we made it past this if check as well, we know that we do have valid events. So therefore now in the next lecture, we'll then output those events.